The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
It's music and dance to about 3,500 children, adults, and teens each semester. One program that may be of interest to this audience is our Artist Visions Lecture Series, moderated by Robert Storr, Senior Curator in Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. This year's program includes Jörg Immendorf on January 25th, Paul McCarthy, Robert Ryman, and Shireen Nishat, and we hope you'll join us for those lectures. This evening's program, Women in the Visual Arts, is part of the incredible Ruth and Oliver Stanton About Women series. We're particularly grateful to Ruth Stanton and the Ruth and Oliver Stanton Foundation for the support of this program. The next lecture in this series about women is with Liz Smith on November 28th. This evening's program with Cecily Brown, Elizabeth Murray, and Laurie Simmons is moderated by A.M. Holmes. For those of you who came expecting to see Vanessa Beecroft this evening, we are most apologetic. Ms. Beecroft had a scheduling conflict and was unable to be with us. A.M. Holmes is the author of the novels Music for Torching, The End of Alice, In the Company of Mothers, Jack, and the short story collection, The Safety of Objects. A contributing editor to Vanity Fair, Mirabella, Bomb, and Blindspot, Ms. Holmes' fiction and nonfiction has appeared in Art Forum, Elle, Esquire, Harper's Bazaar, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and numerous other publications. She is also the author of artist catalogs for Cecily Brown, Rachel White Reed, and Ken Probst. Her work has been translated into 10 languages and is much anthologized. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, and a Deutscher Jungen Literaturpreis, which is a German literature prize. Please forgive my pronunciation. The format for this evening will be as follows. A.M. Holmes will be out shortly to introduce Elizabeth Murray, Laurie Simmons, and Cecily Brown. Each artist will then come on stage and do a brief slide presentation. At the end of the slide presentations, we're going to take a momentary break to set up the stage, and then Ms. Holmes and the artists will gather together on stage for an informal discussion about their work and ideas. If you are interested in asking a question this evening, you should have received an index card on the way in. The ushers will pick them up at some point, and we will present them to Ms. Holmes toward the end of the program. Without any further ado, please welcome A.M. Holmes. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks. I'm incredibly pleased to be here tonight with three artists that I admire enormously for their talent, their courage, and their willingness to join me in this conversation. They are all artists who in one way or another have broken the rules and whose work pushes the boundaries of art making. I'm just going to introduce them very, very briefly because I want them to have a chance to show you their work, and then we'll actually get into talking about what they're up to. Elizabeth Murray is one of the foremost practitioners of painting today, best known for her shaped paintings, which are like explosive jigsaw puzzles, animated, bimorphic, in constant motion. She has degrees from the Art Institute of Chicago and Mills College and has taught at Princeton and Yale, among many other places. She's also been the recipient of numerous awards, including a 1999 MacArthur Foundation Award. Laurie Simmons' photographs are dioramas of the domestic, highly theatrical excavations of the psychological, haunting for the melancholy evocations of a time that never was. She has a degree from Tyler School of Art and has exhibited widely. In 1997, the Baltimore Museum of Art organized a 20-year retrospective of her work. She frequently teaches in the photography program at Yale and has two shows opening in New York next week, one at Pierce Garstadt uptown and the other at Jeffrey Deitch downtown. Cecily Brown's paintings are about seeing and being seen. They are voyeuristic, high-spirited eruptions, fleshy explosions, beautiful and vile all at once. This is action figure painting, a hybrid of art history and cartoon history, rich, disruptive, extreme. Cecily has a BA from the Slade School of Art in London and has been exhibiting in London and New York. She has a show opening this spring in Berlin and an exhibition next fall at the Gagosian Gallery in Los Angeles. Please welcome the artists, and we'll begin with Elizabeth Murray.
I'll start with a early work, and instead of trying to talk about the paintings, I'll talk a little bit about being an art student in Chicago in 1958 and coming to New York in 1967 when I was a young woman. When I was in art school, it never occurred to me that being a woman made any difference. I spent my first couple of years at the Art Institute of Chicago sort of stumbling between commercial art and art education and trying to figure out what to do with myself. And then I realized, mainly from looking at the paintings in the museum, that they were done by real people and I could be a painter. I started to study painting, and I have to say that most of my idols were all men. I learned to paint from men. I think I had one woman teacher. I did have one woman teacher. The difference between her actually and the men teachers were really that she was more nurturing. On the other hand, I didn't necessarily think that she had any as powerful a kind of taste as some of my men teachers had. And I think that that is a kind of cultural thing, that growing up in the 50s and in the early 60s, without even thinking much about it, the men had the power. And it didn't really, on the other hand, it didn't really occur to me that anything could stop me from being a painter, that it had anything to do with gender. And nobody ever told me that either. Not my teachers or any of my peers, that there was anything to stand between me and being a painter. And what I wanted, of course, was to be a great painter. I moved to New York in 1967. I still had not really, I think I was probably pretty naive, and yet it still had not crossed my mind that there was anything to stop me from pursuing my work, although my idea of how you could be an artist was that you really had to kind of confine yourself to a garret and definitely stay single, maybe not asexual, but single, that you couldn't have a family, that what you had to do was work all day, go home at night, and do your work. And that was my plan for my life, really. There wasn't any kind of idea that the kind of recognition that you could have was really just from your friends. I never thought about showing in a gallery, and I never really thought much about making any money. It just wasn't something that young people, young artists really focused on at that point. I also had never heard the word feminism. In the early 70s, when I think there was a kind of revival of feminism. I mean, my idea of feminism really were the suffragettes. And Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which I really read more for the sex than I did for the politics. So I joined a women's consciousness raising group, which were mostly, there were a few artists, but they were mostly women who were the girlfriends or the wives of artists. But it was the first time in my life experience where I really found support from other women. And it was a very incredible experience that really, I think, changed me and inspired me and encouraged me in a way that I'd never really felt encouraged before. But again, I never felt at this point, and I was beginning to show my work at that point, that there was anything gender-wise that could stop me from being the artist I wanted to be. And I still feel that way, even though at this point, I definitely, these are later pieces, these are recent paintings. I see power relations and between, not so much between men and women artists in the art world, but between collectors and curators and the powers that economically sort of conduct and run the art world from the outside, not from the inside out, from the outside in a very different way than I did when I started. So that's just the beginning of my early story and where I stand now, really. Thanks.
It's a challenge to be asked to speak about my work for 5 to 10 minutes because I've been making my work for a long time, and I've made many series of pictures, with each series feeling like a chapter of a novel that I just can't quite figure out how to finish. If not a novel, then maybe a train ride. My first pictures being when I boarded the train, most of the stops unknown, and certainly with no idea about the journey's end. The most interesting part of being asked to speak for 5 to 10 minutes is to sift through hundreds of images and see which ones make the cut. Because like fashion or movies or books, I think my own work goes in and out of style with me. I leave out a few chapters or add a few sentences, which makes the story a little bit different every time. I value the pictures I made before anyone ever came to my studio, before I really knew if art would be my life's work, meaning a public art life. I was looking at art in the early 70s that was experimental and tough, and yet when I worked in the studio, I made something so staged, so fictional, and so achingly sweet that I was actually embarrassed by it. It was a free and simple time to work when no one was looking over my shoulder. There was a sense that nobody cared, but the absolutely best version of that, which was that I didn't want anyone to care. As a result, I regard that time as a model for the perfect work state. No one was in the room but me. I'm still not certain how I took my interest in art, which was connected to philosophy, mathematics, language, and systems, and ended up taking pictures of dollhouse interiors and cowboys and fish tanks. It was a far cry from the art I was interested in, but I believed as long as I applied a formulaic strategy to shooting, I would keep myself pure and true to my conceptual underpinnings. So I developed a strict relationship to light, color, and tiny incremental turns of the subject. The figures I photographed existed in tight, almost claustrophobic spaces. They were mostly alone, detached, and never part of a larger narrative. When I first showed my work, a feminist motivation was almost instantly assigned to it. I was actually relieved to have certain intentions spelled out by writers because I wasn't quite ready to face the less absolute, more psychological or unconscious layers of my own work. Oddly, I had never seen the pictures as a disapproving critique of women's lot in life, but I was willing to accept whatever was said, and also it was very exciting to be written about. Every body of work that I make responds in some way to what came before. It's my attempt to develop a dialogue with the viewer, though I always wonder who's actually listening. The artist Mel Bachner talks about the contemporary art discourse like a card game. You show me your hand, I'll show you mine. If that's the case, I often felt like I was playing cards with myself. While I was hyper-aware of the moves of my peers, I was actually most interested in what I was going to do next. The cowboy pictures gave me the chance to show off with the camera. I conflated space and made tiny pebbles look like boulders and puddles look like lakes, and I was able to run the stereotype of a man as a cowboy, a primary gender type of classic Hollywood movies. A kind of toy alpha male, which seemed to counter my previous homemaker stereotype. In playing to my imaginary audience in 1981, I felt I really needed to change. I didn't want to be the dollhouse person anymore. I thought about aquariums and fish tanks, which also had a claustrophobic feeling and a blue light that I felt like I'd seen in my other series. And I took a bunch of props and friends and went swimming. Once the camera turned on humans, I was hooked on what I saw. Terrified as I was of being accused of photographing the classic nude, I figured the water gave it some distance. I hoped that the water ballet pictures were aloof and menacing and wry, and I was very nervous about using real people, but the bottom line was a desire to be underwater. I see my real ballet pictures as a rush back to doll-like figures, a kind of art panic attack. I certainly didn't want to be misunderstood. I was part of a new and rigid postmodern world where art was in quotations and artists could borrow material from everywhere. High culture, low culture, TV, shopping bags, cupcake wrappers. I wasn't sure where real people fit into that story. And when I photographed the color-coordinated interiors, I returned to a safe color formula. The red doll belongs in the red room, the blue doll matches the blue room. I gave myself a chance to parody conformity and interior design, two topics that I'm way too interested in. In tourism, I took the woman out and fabricated a travelogue of places I probably wished I was most of the time. It was kind of like an all-girls teen tour. I was finally putting groups of women together and in front of great monuments. I made these pictures initially to talk about the impossibility of original experience, and every image of a site is so well known to us, it's almost a letdown to encounter the real place, although I eventually came to enjoy the secondhand view. Ventriloquism occupied my thoughts for a number of years in the mid-'80s. It was time to focus on men again, and ventriloquism was the magic of my early years. So many kinds of relationships come up between the dummy and ventriloquist: paternal love, buddy love, brotherly love, homosexual love. I liked the low-tech nature of the show and the wisecracking male bonding sessions, and even the way women were always the targets of the sarcastic, flat-footed jokes. It seemed like a lot of vicious and taboo humor was legitimized before its time simply because the dummy said it. I became really tired of imagining what went on in the mind of a dummy, and I was tired of making trips to the Ventriloquist Museum in Kentucky, where I shot most of my pictures. I was tired of male humor, I was tired of brains, and more interested in brawn. And when I thought about the kind of physicality that would be absolutely counter to the little dummy figures I'd been playing with. I kept dwelling on a TV ad I'd seen almost practically pre-memory. An image of cigarette packets dancing across a shiny floor. It made me think about people being subsumed or burdened or morphed in some way by their habits or possessions or style choices. I definitely wanted to make my own musical of dancing characters, so I invented a group of top-heavy creatures, starting with a camera, a cake, a purse, a toilet, and ending a few years later with the grand finale, all of the characters coming out to say goodbye. I was not, however, finished exploring the inside of the dummies' minds, and I needed one more go-around where instead of putting words in the dummies' mouths, I filled thought bubbles with their fantasies. I like the idea of a female dreaming up a caricature of a male fantasy, and the fantasies I gave them were solely my projections of what I thought those guys would be thinking. The picture of the female dummy from the Music of Regret series is, that's more about my fantasy. I've realized in recent years that themes of longing, desire, and regret hibernate in all my pictures. Imagining what might have been or the road not taken provides an alternate reality, a place where things are lost or left alone. It's a great place to take pictures, and all the actors are cast by me. The rules of the script are written by me. No one edits for continuity of past and present or fact and fiction. On April 16th, 1997, I photographed a black bathroom with a doll taking a bath. It was meant to be the cover for a book about a 20-year survey show I was mounting that year. I thought if I could actually put myself in the pictures, it might be a proper ending for the story I was telling. And then maybe I could start a new story. The pictures that came next ended the story again, and the ones that came after that ended the story again. And I think that for an artist, even a story with 5 endings is still the beginning of the story. Thanks.
Hi. Does this just come on automatically? First of all, I should apologize in advance in case I'm kind of spaced out. I've got antibiotics and cough medicine with codeine. So hopefully I can actually string a sentence together, but please be patient if I'm a bit inarticulate. So this is a painting from about 3 years ago. Called Trapeze, and I put this in for those of you who don't really know the work. This is quite, basically I've barely ever changed the subject since I started painting. So this is quite typical from where I started. This is around the time I started exhibiting. And talking about being in the tradition of men. Again, it's interesting how you don't really, I just started painting never thinking of myself as a woman painter, but just as a painter, although most of the work that I loved was by men, mostly by dead men. It wasn't till the work started being written about that I found myself posited as sort of some 4th generation abexer and sort of macho painter, and that it was talked about that it was interesting to see this kind of work done by a woman. So, I mean, I've just always carried on painting. I'm interested in, the subject has barely ever changed, but really the subject's more of just a starting point. The work is basically concerned with very old-fashioned things like color and space and things like this. This was where I think I started playing with changing the scale of figures within a painting and started exploring the fact that within a painting, anything can happen, that what's exciting is that it's this fictional world and really you can get away with anything. And if you choose to have, you know, big figures where the little one should be, or vice versa, then you know, if you can pull it off, if you can paint it in a convincing way, you know, it'll work. It'll hopefully be convincing. Same with, you know, use of color. This is called One Touch of Venus. And I think with every painting, one work always leads to the next. They're very unplanned. Each one sort of has its own rules and is pretty organic. I'm never really sure how it's going to turn out when I start, and I'll work on 4 or 5 sometimes simultaneously, and what happens in one will lead to some, you know, spark off something in another painting. This is a pretty thinly painted one. Others get very, very worked. This is the girl who had everything. And this began as an image of a woman looking in a mirror, which is a pretty loaded subject. But that then went off, you know, the sort of painting. This is a 9-foot square painting, and one of the first that I'd done of this size. And sort of, it may have started as a woman looking in a mirror, but went away from that pretty quickly. The arse is about the only thing that sort of, if you focus on that, then you can sort of lead into where the rest might have been in the first place. But lots of other things start happening, and what's exciting to me is to sort of get the balance between letting the painting go in the way that it wants, and then bringing it, you know, a balance between my controlling it and it deciding which way it wants to go. And the next one is a similar composition and subject. I draw all the time, and I draw a lot from photographs and other images. And these both started from some turn-of-the-century photographs from Paris of spanking. And I'd drawn images from these photos again and again for a long time before I ever actually put them into a painting. And just really, I mean, I think it's, can you reverse this? Yeah, so just how different those two pictures are, even though they're started from a similar source and motif, I think, and I've done others of the same subject. So in a way, I feel like you can, like the images that I use to draw from, I can use the same ones again and again and again. It seems like I only need very limited source material in order to, and you know, they just spark off, can go in many different directions. Something, this is called Spree. All the paintings are named after movies, usually nothing to do with the actual movie, but more partly from not liking things to be untitled, but also, and there always seems to be a movie with the right title that suits the painting. So Spree, this is one of starting to get more fragmented and explosive and ambiguous. So the work's really gone back and forth in the last couple of years, where some are much more graphic and immediately recognizable, and others you really have to look quite hard to figure out what's going on. And just as there's sort of about a moment of change. So just as you think you've pinned down what's happening, you can squint or focus in a different part of the painting, and it'll shift into something quite different, something I'm very interested in the sort of ambiguity and openness, and so that the viewer can bring what they want to it. This is Dog Day Afternoon, which is actually a body print, which seems a very Neanderthal thing to do. It really was a dog day afternoon, a summer before I had air conditioning, and just sort of, it was a day's painting, which is very unusual. I like it for that reason, because often they go on for months and months and get very overworked, and this was a real quick one and just seemed to happen by itself. And it's one of those ones where I don't even know really what's going on. but it works for me. And that I still carry on. There's a sort of test of if it remains open and if I still keep seeing more things in them all the time by shifting focus and so on, then I think it works as a painting. I really want them to keep getting more exciting the more you look at them. And this is Candy. There's obviously quite a lot of sexual imagery or sex in a lot of them. This is one of the only ones I've ever done with a single figure, or what looks at first like a solitary female figure. I think I was afraid to do a woman for a long time. I'd do men and women, or men and men, but just to do a woman seemed... I felt for a long time, why would you really want to add to the images of, surely there are enough images of women, but then I figured if that's the thing I'm scared of doing, I should probably try and do it. And in fact, there were lots of sort of shadows of male figures coming in, and the golden part, which is like a mirror, and sort of lurking figures in the room. They're nearly always as there's nearly always some action going on, the central action, and then the voyeurs or ghosts of voyeurs or other people watching as... This is one of the very worked ones, Putting on the Ritz, which was the last painting of last year. It was very corny, sort of painting against the millennium, just before my show, which was in January. Which this is about as abstract as it gets, and although in reality, if you saw it in the flesh, there's a lot more figuration than it might appear from this. But you really have to, it's a sort of hide and seek. There are lots of heads and body parts going on, layers of different imagery going on, and I think it's always very rooted in the body, even when it's not that clear that there are figures there. So, and I like playing with something that may at first look like an eye, then becoming a mouth or a breast, or just the way if you repeat parts of the body again and again, that they almost become like these sort of mandalas, as if there's some truth in the shapes of the body and the shapes of sex. If you repeat them often enough, it's as if they're sort of imprinted on the inside of your brain somewhere, and that I want there to be a sort of deja vu feeling when you look at them, that and in the shapes in between things, that they hit you somewhere and you're unconscious, but it's hard quite to pin down quite where. And in something like this, especially, this is called Interlude. I'm always trying to do more of these white paintings because it's the hardest thing for me to do, where the restraint is really the order of the day, and just trying to really get the spaces in between the things without necessarily having the things themselves. This is there's just as much sort of, there's penetration and all these different things going on, but it's, I like the way that the eye has room to breathe and wander between the things, and that it actually is just as violent as something like that very worked Putting on the Ritz, but it's kind of tricks you into thinking it's calm. And this is much more, this is one more recent, and so sort of finally, with the earlier paintings, I finally got sick of this thing of, that it could always, that parts of the body were constantly changing and in flux, and it could be a thigh, but perhaps it's an arm, and perhaps it's a torso, and the fact that, it could be many things at once, and I just really wanted to pin down and say, no, it's not 35 figures, maybe. It's really just 2 figures, and try and see how... Somebody asked me if I'd ever painted a pornographic painting, and I said, no, I haven't, but perhaps I should try. But I wanted to try and see how close it could get to being pornographic, but hopefully not be. And, and that start the question of when it becomes pornographic. I really don't think this is, but I wanted to see how close I could get to being this, graphic, and for it still to be interesting as a painting. And whereas with the other ones, I felt sometimes that there was too much going on for you really to see the subject. I wanted to sort of reverse that and see if there's this much subject, are you still really going to be able to address it as a painting? And hopefully it worked. That's it.
System shutdown?
Thank you guys very much. Oh, I shouldn't say you guys. Gal, sorry, I blew the whole thing just now. It's been interesting because in the last few days I've actually had a chance to sit down with Cecily and Elizabeth and Laurie and talk to them about a lot of different things and sort of ask them what they're thinking about and what is interesting. And I have about 10,000 questions I'd like to ask them now, which may be a problem. But I almost thought I wanted to start off by asking, what are your thoughts even now in November of 2000 and being asked to be on a panel of women and art? And are we ever going to get to a point where it's just a panel on art? We don't want to put,
Do I have to speak spontaneously?
Yes, or you can read it.
Is that not possible? Elizabeth, I think you have to start again.
Because I'm the oldest? Okay, I'll go first. Well, I think that's just a reality, that it's still it's interesting to talk about it. And people really are thinking more about it in a very real way. It's just not resolved. And the thing I think is different is, not different, I still think it's exciting. I mean, in a lot of different levels I was interested in first of all, I think that there is like a very exciting, real opposition between the sexes and at the same time a magnetism and an interest. And I think a lot of what we feel as women and as men as we go into this thing together has something like primal, like basically to do with that, and then a lot of it is culture. But I was really interested in Cecily's last talking about the painting that you where you were really dealing with the possibility of pornography and keeping it not pornography, and you didn't want it to be, and yet you really played with that idea. And for some reason, I feel like that kind of confronts very directly, like a woman dealing with those issues really openly, and that it's still something that men think about in some ways, women think about in other ways. So, not very clear, but that's an answer.
What do men and women think about differently?
Never mind. Well, A.M.
I guess what I'm curious about is, I mean, one of the things that interests me is, I think that you're all making art, and I think you're all obviously women artists, but you're not making women's art, and you're not making art that's overtly feminist in any particular way. And when I was talking to you, we also talked a lot about how when you're in the studio, you're not thinking, oh, I'm a woman artist, I'll make, woman art or whatever. But yet there still is, when it goes into the world, there somehow is always a difference. And there for a long time was an ongoing debate and almost problem in the sense that women weren't getting shows. I mean, the Guerrilla Girls were putting up lists of what galleries were showing what women artists and what the scorecard was, basically. And it seems there has definitely been a shift of some sort. But I'm sort of curious to hear more about, I don't know, your relationship to that or your thoughts on it.
I know that when I started out, I had a really fierce desire not to be marginalized. And I didn't, I was certainly respectful of women artists and conscious that I was one, but I really wanted to compete with the guys, in the sense that I wanted to be in the museum shows, I wanted to be in the galleries, and I actually actively thought or pondered how I could do that. And one of the simplest ways I realized in the beginning was not to make 8 by 10 or 11 by 14 inch photographs. And I thought, well, if I start to make a photograph that's similar in size and scale to a painting, maybe it could hang next to a painting and somebody would notice it. And that actually, as simple, I mean, that's not very complex, and as simple as that sounds, that actually started to work. And
To work at a larger scale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to work that, in the sense that there were museum shows and curators and dealers who were forced to start to consider this photographic-based artwork in the same way that they had to consider a painting.
We finished my I think it was never even a question for me. I mean, because of the hard work that previous generations did, like the Guerrilla Girls, I don't feel that I ever came up against the struggles that women of the early generations might have, even 10, 20 years before, even 10 years before. In a way, now it's probably harder for a straight white male to get a show than it is for a young woman. It's perfectly clear that women are making most of the best art at the moment. And my generation, especially, it's like there's barely a young male artist getting any shows. But so I think especially for that reason, I never, until people started pointing out, saying, oh, this is interesting because it's by a woman. As I said before, I never, when I'm painting, I'm not thinking, you don't wake up and paint as a woman. You'd paint as a painter. I think I said to you the other day, it's like probably the 2 times in life when I'm least aware of my gender is when I'm painting and when I'm looking at art, which is why it's never been a problem for me to be so influenced by and love so much art by men. I just figure that would be a problem if this was 50 years from now. If my grandchildren still, find that there aren't that many women of, dead women whose work to look at, then that would be a problem. But I just don't think that's going to be the case. So I think now, and I think, you feel a little bit of guilt, perhaps, that I do sometimes, that my work's not political enough or something, or about being a woman enough. But perhaps that's being a good feminist is not making an issue of that. And, with all respect to the work that women, like artists of the 70s did, that was drawing attention to how hard it was.
Well, there's always something to feel bad about.
Yeah.
I feel bad I'm not a painter, but you can always find a way to feel guilty. That's the easy part. But I actually find what you're saying, whether it's true or not, that the best artists of your generation are all women, I mean, that's yet to be seen. The fact that you feel that way, and you feel this kind of comfort, and you feel this kind of freedom in your life and your work, actually makes me feel really good. And, probably the struggles that I had were far less than the generation that preceded me. And I felt that keenly. I was keenly aware of the fact that the women generation before me had more of a struggle to have their work be seen and heard. So if this is the way you're feeling, I think that I can believe it. I think that it's a really positive thing.
Laurie, we've talked about, because when we talk about, Laurie teaches a lot up at Yale, and we've talked a lot about your students and how their work is sort of very unself-consciously female and sort of capturing and articulating a sort of a part of female experience that we haven't even seen represented in art before in some ways, and how it seems that the work is not feminist or post-feminist, it's actually just girl is. And that there seems to be on one level a complete lack of consciousness of what came before. And I'm wondering whether that's a good thing or if that's a problematic thing, that there is no sense of the history. It's like time started in 1985 for some people.
You mean this sort of babe thing that's going on?
Well, part of the babe thing.
Well, I'm sure you have a feeling about it, but one of my main feelings is that in terms of the people doing the work and making the work, I mean, I want to know how they feel about it. I think it's important not to feel slimed in any way by what you do, not to feel these reverberations of, not to feel weakened in any way by your own sense of your own, sexuality or gender. And, I'm watching it really carefully, and I'm very interested in it, and I really want to see how it all sort of pans out and how it makes them feel. I mean, it's very young yet, this whole sort of, it's not even really a movement.
Is it a problem, though, if younger artists aren't cognizant of the history of how they got there, or is that okay?
I feel like even, with my own daughters, I don't want them to thank me all the time for all of the freedoms that they're experiencing and the fact that they can wear tank tops and on the street. I think it's important for people to just, be able to
Live?
Yeah, gotta live.
Elizabeth, do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I actually feel both ways about it. I think that it's natural for young people when they're starting. I mean, it's almost as though you have to go blank in your mind, because if you keep all of history inside your head, you could hardly take a step. And so there's a positive part, I think, with kids who are, in any way, you think it's all basically crap anyway, for the most part, unless they are dead artists. But anybody who's close to you, like I was taking my students around the other day to galleries, and a couple of places that we walked into, I would say to a student, male or female, I brought you here because I really want you to see this work. Like I told one student, I took them to the Matthew Ritchie show, and one student in particular is doing exactly what he's doing on a much different level. And the kid said, I hate this work. I hate this. And it took a little bit for him to even see the connection, that he could learn something from it. And I think that's like a natural thing. When you're younger, you kind of deny. You have to deny what's right ahead of you or right behind you. But for me, history's been really important. And I think the past is really rich, and it's to be loved and hated and exploited. And all my really great ideas have come from other painters, really. And I think maybe I know that there's something inside of me that transforms them, and I really trust them. But I think that for me that's important, and maybe that makes me really kind of I'm really traditional, I'm a modernist. But I think what Laurie's saying is really important, that I don't want my kids, and I don't want young artists to like have to say to me, thank you so much for what you've done, you've been here. Because I basically, it's very selfish. I mean, I've wanted to do this and I've managed to do this, and it's been as much for myself as anything else.
One thing I wanted to add to that is that in terms of my students and young artists, I don't tolerate a lack of art historical knowledge, at least contemporary art historical knowledge. What I do think is the biggest challenge for young artists, and starting with my students and young artists, is to find their subject. And, you know, my subject has always been myself. I mean, women. My own experience as seen through my eyes. And for a lot of these young women who have been my students, at least they've found their subject. You know, whether it's this, you know, prepubescent sexuality, post-adolescent, you know, mired in their own teenage years, it's their subject, and I think it's very real.
I think, well, the most important thing is having a subject. After that, you know, I mean, that's a big problem. If somebody doesn't know their subject or doesn't have a subject, they can, you know, as long as that's taken care of.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's one thing I wanted to say in terms of that, like just in terms of subject. One of the things that happened when I first came to New York was that really threw me for a loop. The first really feminist work I saw that I thought that I was told was feminist, and it was about being a woman and women really doing their subject, was work by, I could think of one person, a woman named Miriam Shapiro. And it was using quilts and craft things and doilies, and I hated it. I just thought it was terrible. But what I had to sort of admit much later was that, and Judy Chicago, and these people were reviled. People really, especially Judy Chicago, do you know who she is? She had this huge show going around with the I forget the name of the show, but it consisted of The Last Supper, with plates and all. It was completely about women. And the kind of hatred and bad reviews, I mean, it would be enough to drive any person completely out into the wilds, never to do work again. It was pretty horrible. But what came out of all those ideas, I mean, if you look at a lot of work that's being done now, it's clear that that work had a very powerful effect. And a lot of women and men looked at it and used those materials in another way that, for some reason that I don't totally understand, became much more acceptable as time went on.
Yeah, I think that at that sort of early feminist stage in art, there were female materials being used, you know, quilting and doilies, as you said, menstrual blood, hair, sewing, things things that I was absolutely repulsed by and tried to work against. But it's true what you're saying, it was about that time. I think there's a way that people can use materials now as varied as makeup or licking chocolate or body parts and things that are coming up again now because, as you say, the time is right, when then it was just what actually was marginalizing women's art. You know?
It's the kind of work that you feel needed to be made. I mean, somebody had to do it, really. That's why I'm glad to be 20 years later. So I can just, I mean, you can really say what could be more feminine than paint if we're talking about, you know, the gender of a material. But it's a relief to me that that was all got out of the way, because even though I don't like most, it was kind of necessary for someone to do it, I think. And open things up. I mean, now that you can use pretty much anything in work. I mean, well, you'll still see women using those kind of materials. And
But men using them too, I mean, I think that's what's interesting, is that it became somehow the non-art material that women brought into the art world now has been appropriated by everybody and has become definitely, it's also something about a lot of the work has become much more autobiographical and intimate and more along the lines of the kinds of things that women were doing then. Men have stolen all that.
Well, it might be harder for men to use paint now, just as for
they should
a
just
man
give it
to
up
be a macho
entirely.
painter now is much harder than for someone like me to be a macho painter, I think.
Exactly. One of the things that yesterday, Elizabeth, when we were talking, was you mentioned feeling a certain kind of freedom, knowing that you wouldn't be held to the same standards as like Pollock and de Kooning and Johns. And I was curious to hear more about what is that, and are women judged by different standards, or is it just that, do people, I don't know, do they look at the work differently?
Well, now that you're saying it to me
know, it
up
sounds
here, it sounds a
exactly, I
lot
know.
different. Well, I think I didn't mean judging by a different standard. Like, when I started out, even though truly I wasn't thinking at all, and none of us were like, I'm going to be a woman artist. I mean, I was going to be an artist on my terms and on life's terms, and there wasn't any woman or male involved in it. But I did have the feeling, and I got the feeling, it started sitting around in the cafeteria with all the guys at the Art Institute of Chicago at the school. Because the guys would sit around, and I would be usually the only woman sitting there, and because I was one of the few women in the painting department, and they would start to really carry on about what really made a great painting, and this painting upstairs with this and that and that. And I would think, God, I just don't feel that way about that work. Like, it would be something, when they talked about Cezanne, they would talk about Cezanne in this really different kind of way than, I mean, I just thought Cezanne was this gushy, lushy painter where the colors are really beautiful and the forms were all kind of mushed together in these interesting ways. And I did feel like, I didn't think, well, I'm a woman and I have a different way of thinking about these things. I just thought, I feel different. I don't have to think about these things in this way. I can feel it this way. Not that I said that, but it just felt like I could take a sort of side path. And those guys were on the football field, really out there like doing it, and I could like run along the edge and do my own thing and not pay any attention to the kind of concerns that they had. And it was very liberating. And to tell you the truth, I think I still feel that way. Like, just that, really.
Right. Do you have any thoughts along those lines?
I just was remembering all those guys in art school that would pick a hero a month. You know, like one month it was Pollock, and the next month it was Smithson, and, you know, things would kind of move around. And that thing about adopting, how the guide artist would adopt another guy to...
Yeah, and we didn't really have anybody we could adopt in that quite... Well, I mean, I had heroes.
Yeah, sure. That's one of my
Definite
questions
heroes.
on page 75 here is, who are your heroes? Who are the people that you guys, what fed you and what feeds you now?
Well, the first person, the painter I saw who really got me going was de Kooning. And then it was Gorky. And then it was the pop artists, all except for Marisol, whose work I really thought was fabulous. Jasper Johnson Rauschenberg, they were the people that I looked at when I was a kid and learned from, copied, shamelessly. Still do.
Cecily?
Velázquez, Goya, Caravaggio, Titian, people like that. And then de Kooning, Bacon, Warhol, not directly, but Twombly, and Johns a lot as well.
I'm not good on the heroes question.
Do you have another question?
No.
I think one of the things also that I guess I'm interested in, and not about being a women artist, but what are you obsessed by? I know you have many obsessions, Laurie, but what propels you, or how, especially in sustaining a career over time, what is part of that progression for you, or how do you find the next thing? And this is geared more towards you and Elizabeth, but also just in general,
Well, I think I tried to touch on this in what I talked about before, but I never really feel like I'm quite getting it right. And it gets me really excited about doing the next thing that I'm going to do, because I think I can, get something that I'm thinking about, get it a little more directly, go to it a little more correctly. And, I may have this life on this earth plane that I'm living every day, but I have this parallel art life that I'm living that is very active, and I have no interest in stopping living it, and it needs to be fed, and it needs ideas, and I have to keep working on it. I mean, I don't know how else to express it, but it's another, it's a parallel track to what I'm doing, and I think I'm motivated. Well, you just have to do it. I mean, it's not, there's not a lot of depth to the answer to that question about, I think you're asking why you make art, or what keeps you, is that what you're?
I'm not asking why you make it, but I'm asking what hooks pull you through it in a way, and how do you get to the next thing, and how do you sustain it over a long period of time?
Well, another secret is that sometimes you just don't do it at all, and for long periods of time. But you have to take breaks, but I'd be curious to hear what these guys say.
Well, yeah, not getting it right, and pursuit of perfection, and acceptance of imperfection. I could go on and on and on with the same painting for years, probably. So accepting that this one's not going to be the perfect painting. I think I used to try more to get everything into one painting. So allowing that this one isn't going to be it, but perhaps the next one will. But, kidding yourself, sort of suspending disbelief from day to day. But there's just that one work demands another,
right.
Because you're never going to get it all. And it is that keeps you excited, because just knowing you're never going to get it.
Do you think men think they're not getting it right? Think, hey, I made a perfect painting, I'll make another.
Oh, no, but you have to think for at least half the day that you're getting it right.
Yeah, most of the men artists I know are very insecure.
But they deal with insecurity in a different way, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there's more like, I hate, this is generalizing, but I do think that women, maybe what I was trying to say before was like, I don't get it right very often. And I used to think I got it right more when I was younger. And now I feel like I'm getting older and I'm still not going to get it right. And I've never really ever thought of myself as a genius or brilliant in any way at all. And I know the fact is that I'm not. So it's like taking your imperfections and trying for perfection and feeling for a few minutes that you get it and then losing it. But I think we're all four of us, probably we could say that one thing we all have in common is that we're four driven women. In probably the very same way that men are, in terms of really loving, in some sense, to do our work, even though we hate it at the same time.
Right.
And I think that men may have a very different way where they have to deal with themselves as potential geniuses, or geniuses maybe, even though they're just as insecure as we are. Because from the top out, maybe there's some kind of higher expectation or another way that they have to kind of protect their egos, when really we all have, just as human beings, this, we're trying something that if we fail, we really feel badly about, whatever it is.
You just led me actually right into my next question, which was, I read a quote in the New York Times Magazine article about you, where Jennifer Bartlett, the artist, said that you were one of the first women she met who was ambitious as any of the men that she knew, and that you worked constantly, lived on grape nuts, and what she called a real artist. And I guess one of the things I'm interested in is, can we talk about the importance of ambition, and are men more ambitious, or have women just had to hide their ambition And is it okay to be ambitious, and how ambitious are you?
Very. You know, I think ambition in art, ambition for an artist is a strange subject because I don't see it as the same kind of ambition that would propel somebody who wants to get ahead at the firm, you know, in the company, or what you do. The ambition that you have is in the service of your work. It's in the service of respecting your work and believing in your work and doing what you have to do to keep making your work, to keep your work visible, to keep your work interesting. And I think that the fierceness, the ambition that you're asking about is really all in the service of this. I mean, I'm not trying to disown, you know, an ambitious streak, but it is a desire, a really strong desire or belief that your work should be positioned in a certain way, in a certain place in this world that we live in. And for that, you would do almost anything.
Yeah, I feel everything that you're saying. What I would add to that is, and I think this is something that's important, I think that psychologically, it is very difficult for women, certainly of my generation. There are a lot of psychological complexities to being successful and to being not just, and before you're successful, you're saying, I'm doing this for myself, I'm going to have this thing that is really important beyond anything else. Not more important than your family or anything. And if you have kids, that all goes together into one package, even though you may want to keep it separate. It just starts ooze into one thing. But I think there are more complexities for women in terms of accepting success, not apologizing for it, staying focused on what, Laurie, what you were saying about your work, and that ambition for really making your work the right way is really, really a very deep thing. And it's not a light thing. And I think it's just complicated for women because we have a lot of other things that society's, certainly in this country, is always telling us we have to be paying attention to. So you have to really stay focused.
I've always thought of myself as, I'm very ambitious for the work. As you said, I want the work to be great. And I certainly thought I was a genius when I was 21. So that's 10 years ago now. So, but I think I had that thing. And that was important at that age to give me the drive and think that I might be. And I don't know if that's more common in women of my age. So yeah, you want the work to be great, or ambitious in that way. I suppose it looks like I'm ambitious from the outside because of, I'm a bit of an art tart. And, sort of seem to have, chosen a certain path. But I was never ambitious for the kind of things that I'm getting, actually, even if I'm quite enjoying some of them now in terms of attention. But I just see that as, a way to, the work getting a lot of attention is really great, and I want lots of people to see it, and it feels fantastic if lots of people are seeing it and knowing it and responding to it, however negatively sometimes. And in terms of, I always kind of thought it would be impossible to have a family. I don't have one yet. So, and sort of thought, and now I'm not so sure, maybe, but, that in a way it seems more ambitious to think perhaps I can do all of it. I think when I was a bit younger, I thought, well, my painting comes first. I can't, if I'm going to be great, I won't be able to have kids. I won't be able to, but now I'm wondering if actually it'd be even more, it'd be a real challenge to see if it can do both. It does scare me because I think, the energy and the way the work comes first, I'm afraid that would, the energy would be dissipated. And I don't want to be a terrible mother whose children hate her painting
We'll talk about that later.
These two I know have a lot of thoughts on that.
Can't avoid it.
Picking up a little bit from the cards that people have been sending up here, and talking about being an art tart for a minute. One of the things, and Elizabeth and I spoke about this yesterday, that's been interesting is it seems as though the previous generation of women artists really had to downplay not just being, well, their sexuality. They had to sort of be almost non-existent sexually, not advertise if they had a family, and sort of kind of move through the world in a different way. And there seems to have been a shift. And Cecily, being an art tart, has been part of that. And the recent sort of the young, beautiful things, and the moment has come where women artists are, I think, almost doing what male artists have done for a long time, which is working it in a certain sense. I'm curious to talk a little about that. One of the questions that came up was, can Cecily Brown talk about posing for Vanity Fair as a, quote, woman artist? And folded in on that same one is, can you address the issues of age of women in art? So that's a big one. But I guess I'm curious to hear thoughts on how that's moved over time, and I don't know how you sort of, for Laurie and Elizabeth, how you sort of shaped yourselves or traveled the art world as women in art. And for Cecily, I think it sounds like, and when we've talked, there's definitely an upside and a downside to being an art tart.
Yeah. One thing, without trying to make an excuse, is that I've always longed to be able to say this in public, which is I am trying to get my green card. Immigration love it. The more attention you've got, the more you're in the media, the more likely you are to get it. But that's disingenuous to say that if it wasn't for that I wouldn't be doing any of this stuff. Posing for Vanity Fair, believe it or not, they came in, we had to argue about, they said, they want you sexy, you have to look sexy. And I said, no, I'm wearing this. And they said, haven't you got some nice, cute little top, haven't you got little painting shorts? Yeah, sure I do, but I'm not wearing them. Their brief was to make all the artists look as sexy as possible. I thought by wearing my baggy clothes and my dollar bill t-shirt, which I think was the big success of the picture, that I was downplaying the sexy thing. There was a half an inch of flesh, which has made it the most criticized picture that I've been in. I must admit, I'm still really not quite sure. It's a dangerous game, I think, to be playing. And it's, the part of me that wanted to be an actress when I was a kid is loving it. At the same time, I've suffered the downside of it, which is people have the works not been looked at sometimes as seriously as I'd like, because I've been seen as being too interested in being famous or being photographed or getting that kind of attention. So I think it's a fine balance. The interesting thing now is I feel that I haven't done anything like that for a year or so, and yet the things will come back and haunt you. So I'm still working it out. I'm playing it as it goes along. Perhaps I did a little bit too much. Of course, you do things over time, and then things don't come out. So suddenly they all come out at once. It looks like all you ever do is have your picture taken. Forget that you paint 363 days a year and you're photographed twice. But, when the things are out there, they'll come back. Like there's an art and auction just ran this thing like a year late saying about artists being photographed too much, and they print 4 pictures at once, so it makes it look real overkill. Perhaps, I don't know, I'm really still figuring it out, I think. So.
Well, I think it is a dangerous game that's being played, but I think we live in a People magazine culture. We live in a real world culture, a survival culture, up close and personal culture, where everybody wants to know the person behind the person, behind the person, behind the person, and what they look like and what they wear and what they eat for breakfast. And it occurs to me that if that's what you have to do, or your generation has to do, if that's your being ambitious for your work and what is required of you, that I'm sure if I was in your position, I would try it and I would do it and I would stretch it, and I would probably feel bad, and I would, I would have a parallel life trying to figure out how to play that. It was, when I was coming of age as an artist, it was considered somewhat unseemly to be, to have, you know, to have that kind of posture, to be photographed too much. There was a way that you had to be taken very, very seriously.
Right.
Seriously. And if that required refusing to talk to the press,
As a woman, you mean much more than...
as a strategy, if,
No, but for women, it was...
yeah, for everybody, for male artists, for everybody. If that required, you know, refusing to talk to the press and having that information come out about you. But on the other hand, then you would have to run over to your gallery and stand in front of an art consultant who was talking about your work in front of, you know, a bunch of potential clients, which, you know, was a totally humiliating experience.
I mean, sorry, go on.
So, yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't really feel like I've done, you know, been asked to do what's in your handbag and, you know, what are you reading on holiday? Yeah. But, you know, I don't feel I've really done things that aren't about the work. That, okay, maybe the picture of the art is bigger than the picture of the work, but still, I enjoy the fact that it is getting the work out to beyond the art world, that I don't like how, you know, the art world being this insider thing. I like it if, you know, if more people are seeing the work.
I'm just really touched that you feel any, and I think it's wrong, that you feel questioning about those pictures, because I think that that's where the double standard comes in. And I remember very well, I know what Laurie's talking about too. I remember being very careful at some point in the 80s when my picture was being taken by Art News. For a while, Art News did cover pictures of, and there was a big to-do about it. It was like the break was made. Suddenly it was okay to have your picture on the front of a magazine. It was an art magazine. That I looked as androgynous as possible and as serious as possible. I think that then Julian Schnabel came along, and he was as outrageous as he possibly could be. And people complained a lot about Julian Schnabel. Oh, he's like really horrible. How can he be so disgusting and seek publicity in this way? And basically, I don't think that Julian cared at all. He just went about his way and took as much, did as much, promoted himself as much as he possibly could. And I have to admit that there were times when it really turned me off, and yet the media just ate it up, and then they would write about him incessantly and then give him a lousy review in the, you know, like for his work. And it's confusing, because I think that so much of it is that you don't want to be controlled by this weird viral media that basically picks you up, shakes you around, and then spits you out. And I think that, you know, I think that you're having fun, and I think it's a different kind of an attitude. And that was what I felt from those pictures, that you were really having fun. Mm-hmm. I think the tricky thing and the dangerous thing is staying in control of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't control the media. It's like cast your name upon the water, but you can control your feelings and what you do with your work, and you can decide that you basically are going to try to use them if you want to, and not let them use you up and use your work.
Yeah.
Well, you have the power to say no, and that ultimately is your greatest strength.
Yeah.
And that's what I've found.
Yeah.
Like, saying no can be really great.
And feel really good.
Yeah.
Of course, nobody knows what you say no to.
You have to publish the
You can
list
publish
of the
it,
things
right.
I said no to this year.
Well, there should be a little magazine, a no magazine.
It's called No. It's just a long list of things,
What
you know,
they won't do.
who didn't do what this week. Exactly. Here's another question from the audience. Do you feel that one part of the art world has more control or more to do with the situation for women in the arts today, specifically actually asking about auction houses, gallery owners and directors, museum curators, collectors? Elizabeth, I know you have an answer for this one.
Well, I'll just give you my quick. At a certain point in my career, which sometimes I separate off from everything else, it's just career, somebody told me that I would never make it unless I had sold something at auction for $500,000 and had a big European market. And that was the first time I was telling AM that I really thought, I think there is a different kind of standard for women when it comes to the resale of paintings. And I think there is. So that's my feeling about that one aspect of that.
Laurie, do you have feelings about an aspect of that?
I'm not sure I understood.
No, me too.
Let me repeat the question. Do you feel that one part of the art world has more control or more to do with the situation for women in the arts today? And I think one of the aspects of that that is sort of interesting is, and some of us have talked about this in our conversations before this, about things like there are more women showing art and making art, but are there, women who are running galleries? Are there women who are running museums? How is that progressing, or do you feel that, I don't know, we could have this person come up and, I guess, do you feel that there are people that are in more control of how women move through the art world than just whatever would happen spontaneously or naturally, or what's the?
I feel like I can't generalize about women moving through the art world. I think it's case by case, right. I can take a woman and talk about her career. Or
Laurie Simmons.
Well,
I mean, do you feel like there are, I guess it's interesting, are there things that you would like to see, let me change the question for a second. Are there things that you would like to see happening in the art world or for women in the art world that aren't happening yet, that need to happen more?
Well, there are certain things happening for certain women and certain, it's a,
right.
I'm not,
okay, I'm just going to rip that question up,
yeah.
I'm sorry. One of the questions, because I know we're running out of time, that I wanted to ask, and when Elizabeth and I were talking, we were saying that this was, in a way, a great opportunity to talk about things that don't get talked about. And I want to know what those things are. I'm curious what you guys think are, girls, are the subjects that aren't discussed, or what are the things that we're sort of afraid to talk about that still just don't happen?
The subject that doesn't get discussed by me and that have in the past been afraid to talk about is the fact that I have children. I think that was touched upon here. And I remember when I made the decision, I remember thinking to myself one day, nobody's asking Julian Schnabel about his children, so I'm not talking about my children. And I was conscious that when I'd go, after I had a child, I'd go to an opening and I'd run into a European collector or dealer, and they'd say to me, well, where are your children? And I thought, why are they asking? Haven't they heard of babysitters? Or I just thought, as soon as I had a child, questions, it wasn't even, how are your children, but where are your, why aren't you with your children, and once you have them, aren't they with you all the time? And I was aware of the fact that, I was aware that a perception of me, I felt that a perception of me changed once I had children. And once I had 2 children, perception changed even further.
What was the change? I mean, that you were...
Well, I think that, and already we're talking some years ago because my oldest daughter is 14, but I think that, perhaps I was self-conscious, but I was aware that I felt that people might be wondering if I could still do my work, or there might be a tendency to take me less seriously because I was, in fact, trying to raise a family and be an artist. And I had those prejudices myself. Just as Cecily, was talking about, I really never believed that I could be an artist and have a family.
Right.
And I think there's a reason why there is an artist wife, why there is that role, because we all need an artist wife. The career is a child, basically. Not the career, the art is a child, and it needs to be taken care of and protected. And, we all need time to do our work. We all need somebody who's going to help us to find time to do our work. Now, your children are really not interested in helping you find time to do your work. That's not what they're about. So what happens? The challenges become that much greater. So it's not only a challenge to your own life and your own time, but a challenge to your sense of yourself as, any every time I considered having a child, I'd say, well, I don't know if it's something I should do. Someone would say to me, well, Elizabeth Murray has children. When I considered having a second child, and I talked to a friend, they'd say, well, Elizabeth has 2 children. So there really aren't a whole lot of role models out there, since Elizabeth was the only one that was ever put up before me.
But now there are 2 of you.
Yeah.
They said that to me too.
What?
Elizabeth, what do you think are the things that need to get talked about more that aren't being talked about?
Well, that is, I think, a really big one, because it is about us being whole. And I don't think that any woman needs to have children to be a whole person. But it's true that there is an idea, and I think it's especially, it's not just from men, it's very much from women, that I remember when my first child was born, and this was my oldest child is 31, and a friend coming over to look at my work, and I was working in this kind of closet, and we were living at West Beth, and we had this little dinky apartment, and it was really just, and there were diapers around and stuff, and a woman said to me, well, and I was my work looked horrible. It was just this awful stuff, really mixed up and confused. And she said, well, what can you do now? And I just felt this complete defeat, like a woman was saying to me, as though the minute I had a child, my whole reason, my whole ability to express myself, to have anything but be a mother, was completely sucked out of me. And it was depressing. It was really depressing. And it's just not true. I mean, whether you have children or whether you don't have children, you are an artist. And the idea that the world would see you this way is really infuriating to me. But I think it's changing just because we're here and we're doing it. The other thing I don't think gets talked about is just the idea of what I tried to talk about with, I'd like to know, honestly, does women's work sell for less than men's? How come when you read Carol Vogel in the auction stuff, hardly ever does the sale of a woman's work, unless they're dead usually, come up? It's all men's work for the most part. And they're just more men artists, or women's work doesn't, because I think that's an important economic aspect of the art world in terms of investment. And that doesn't get talked about very much. I just think there are a lot of little scary topics that people don't want to deal with when it comes to talking about women making their work in the world. And I think it's for good reasons too, that we don't want to separate ourselves off. We're on the playing field and we want to play totally equally.
Yeah, it reminds me of those discussions where Meryl Streep's complaining because she only gets $20 million a picture, and Bruce Willis gets,
Yeah.
is that his name? 31 million or something like that.
I want 10 million.
Right, exactly. Cecily, what do you think needs to get talked about in all, that just doesn't come up when people are talking about art or talking about women in art?
I can't really think of anything. How to make men be better artists' wives? I don't really know. No, I'm sorry, I can't think. I don't know. I don't know. I feel that my friends and I talk about pretty much everything. I don't know, on a wider forum. I don't really.
Well, let me ask you something, Cecily. Do you think that when you got, I thought you were very positive about, the publicity just brought your work out there and made people pay attention. But did you feel there was a double standard in terms of how you were dealt with or criticized?
Yeah, not so. The guys who are doing it, I don't know. John Curran doesn't really seem to get attacked, but then that's partly because he's been around for longer, and they might feel, because part of the reason I was criticized maybe because it might have seemed I've only been around for 5 minutes, and why am I so hyped? It's not like I've got a big career behind me, and John's been around for 10 years or something. But there's a double standard in terms of what men have done in the past. I mentioned to Amy the picture of Richard Prince I saw, and Richard sort of held up as, you can't criticize Richard Prince. I mean, I adore him, but,
Oh, you can.
Okay, you can. But he's certainly, there was this picture of him with no shirt, with his jeans round his hips, and you could even see his tan line, like a completely sexy picture.
Are you sure it was Richard Prince?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an old photo.
Pictures of Pollock, pictures of, I think men have often been photographed in this sort of sexy way or macho way, and it hasn't really affected the way that their work's been thought of or got in the way as much. It may have been in different forums, though. I mean, they might not have done sort of Vogue or Vanity Fair or something.
Well, the Pollock pictures in life, I mean, they're really, one of the questions that and this will wind up soon, but was, about persona, that male artists have definitely been able to embrace the development of persona, whereas women artists seem to, that they had to play it safe on some level or step back from, really pushing their way out there in terms of claiming that space. And certainly Pollock, no one made fun of him when that whole Life spread came out and said, oh, those are too aggressive or sexy, or they are throwing the paint around, or, I mean, that was actually a breakthrough in terms of how artists were presented to the world.
Yeah,
it
I
was.
just thought of something and remembered something. That's Linda Benglis. And I think it was in 72, 73, when, have you ever seen the photograph? I mean, Linda was the first woman artist that I know of, or the first artist who really dealt with her sexuality really openly. It was extremely funny and
Except what was in the
cynical at
picture.
same time.
I mean,
What
was in the picture? I mean, she was dealing with her own sexuality, but, there was as I recall, 20-inch penis in the picture.
That's what I was just thinking about.
I mean, it was a big dildo.
Yeah, it was a really, really big dildo that she was posing naked with, and it was an incredible thing. But it was really a brash statement, I'm, take it or leave it, I'm one of the guys.
And I can do it by myself if I want to.
Exactly.
That said, it's later than we thought.
Right.
We're all going to continue this conversation, so y'all should just come with us. Thank you so much, and thank you to Laurie and Elizabeth and Cecily for joining me.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.